he said he was in a group. There were 3 tanks in one moment because tanks get stacked up on a battlefield. Brian Hathaway, a recent man who was just up here, could tell you about that. But 3 tanks were facing 150 Syrian tanks while Egypt was attacking from the south on Yom Kippur. And he shared how a Syrian soldier said he saw angels with those 3 Israeli tanks. What would you think? I would think, I want to know more about Israel. Well, you want to know more about Israel? That's what we're doing today. What about the second advent? What about Jesus' second coming? What about Jesus' second coming, the other advent, and the nation of Israel? That's the topic tomorrow. We've got a problem. There are people in this church right now that know more about Patrick Mahomes' high ankle sprain than they do about Israel in prophecy. Let's face it. Don't tell me this is too complex. It's spoken in the Bible, the second advent, more than the first advent. As I said 2 weeks ago, there's more verses about Christ's second coming than there is about the atonement. This is a really important subject. We can't neglect the subject because God doesn't neglect the subject. Has Pastor Jeff neglected the subject? Yes, I have. Sometimes it's because people have actually told me not to talk about it, and for some ridiculous reason, I've honored them and respected them. Other times it's because it's just not relevant. You know, I've said this before, current events do have a shelf life. Well, current events are ramping up in a certain direction. Like I said, more people know about Patrick Mahomes' high ankle sprain than the fact that, did you know last night Israel attacked Iran in a major way? Blew up nearly most of their military production facilities and actually killed a number of their leading officers in the Iran defenses. Maybe you didn't know that because we were reading about the high ankle sprain. What follows in these notes is a lot. We're not going to get to all of it. Remember last week I said I just scratched and sniffed the surface? I hope you have your scratchers and sniffers out because you're really going to need them today. What I've been trying to do with this other advent, Christ's second advent, this is the advent that we can't put away. You know, we put away the first advent, right? We put away Christmas. We bring it back out. It's already happened. But this advent hasn't happened. We can't put it away. It hasn't happened yet. So we're anxiously awaiting and expecting it. And for me, it helps, I think, to have a chronological time frame. The opinions are diverse. There's no question about that. But this time frame is the one that I first started learning about in 1980 when I heard a lieutenant colonel in Israeli Defense Forces, later worked alongside some of them as a scuba diver, describe the miracle of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Their officers had told about the miracle of the 1967 war, where Israel, as they were attacked, when the battle was over, 6 days, Israel's wars are always short because God's involved. After the 6-day war, their property, their land had quadrupled in space, and they weren't the ones who were attacked. Only God does miracles like that. And so I dove in, I paid attention. And the time frame that I learned in those early days, just barely going in the ministry, 1980 and there, around the time we got married, that time frame has really continued to work for me. And I've tried to give it up. I've tried to adopt other ones because I have friends that don't agree with the time frame. So the time frame that I've got in the notes is the one that I've held on to, trying to give it away, but every time I go back to study it, I find myself in the same place. So that's why I've been trying to put together these pieces in a bit of a chronological framework. It helps me learn. I already alluded one reason why I thought that studying Israel was really important in prophecy, but I'm going to share 3 more. They're in your notes. Somewhere in every daily news cycle, and you know that there's a daily news cycle, you don't choose that. Somebody else chooses that for you, which means you don't always hear the real news. Honestly, you really don't always hear that real news, and those that are in charge of the news give to you what you want. You probably do or don't know that maybe things aren't going as well for Ukraine as everybody else is telling us. My reports say Ukraine, unfortunately, is experiencing triple-digit soldiers' death every single day. This is why we're sending all these weapons there. We're all fighting a war. The whole world is fighting a war in poor Ukraine against Russia. We need to understand that. That's probably relevant to the fact that the U.S. isn't in prophecy. The U.S. is being weakened right now. Those things are really relevant. How can a nation the size of New Jersey, The size of New Jersey. And they don't talk that way. Well, if you're Jewish, New Jersey, you do. Or if you live in Kansas, you can't do the accent. The size of New Jersey, I'll get it. 0.11% of the world's population is in the news every single day somewhere. Or its enemies in the news every. Why? Why does it garner so much attention? Then number two, this is great fodder for conversation. I've already mentioned this. 4 out of 10 Americans believe we're in the last days. 4 out of 10 Americans can't agree on anything. But we've got 4 out of 10 Americans believing we're in the last days. As we were meeting with the admin team, and these men are the ones who are all nominated for elders and then said they don't want to be one. Next time we're going to nominate women, I think. But anyway, that's another theological conversation, which would be really fun, but we're not going to have it. Because the women are pretty good leaders, and I've just digressed in a way I said I wouldn't do that today. 4 out of 10 Americans believe we're in the last days, so why don't we talk about it? We have a mantra, belong, believe, become, and as we had the celebration gathering here recently, I said, let's make belong connecting, because it's a better, more descriptive word, and let's have believing, discipling, because that's a more descriptive word of what we mean by believing, and let's use the word equipping to talk about what it means to become. I think that's a more descriptive word. And what better way to connect with people than a relevant conversation that 4 of the 10 people you meet, wherever you go, they're thinking about, wow, things are really extreme right now. We may be in the last days. So to connect with people, why don't you ask them, what do you think when you read about Israel in the news? It's a great conversation. Then you say, well, you know what? Israel's a terrorist nation, and they're driving out the Palestinians. They should be destroyed. The devil believes that. It's a great way to begin a conversation. Unfortunately, turn, if you would, to Romans 11. What has God decided to do with Israel? God has decided to do with Israel what God started out to do with Israel. Why is the subject of Israel and the last days so important? Because if God is keeping the promises he made to Israel in the Old Testament, that means he's going to keep the promises he's made to you in the New Testament. And if God's treating all the promises that he made to Israel as metaphors and as allegories, what's that mean to you? Now, I understand some of you might be, Pastor Jeff, I just want to, I don't really care about this. I just want to get along with my coworkers. I want my prodigal child to come back. I honestly, well, this piece of information that God is keeping his promise to Israel ought to convince you that God will keep his promises to you. Seriously. And so I'm going to read in Romans chapter 11, but I'm going to point this out, and many of you are aware of this. There is a theology, a doctrine that is relatively prevalent. I've got friends that adhere to it, called replacement theology, that every time you see Israel, then in the New Testament, it's actually a metaphor for the church, that the church has replaced Israel, that all the promises made to Israel in the Old Testament are actually ours. Now, replacement theology can be entered into quite innocently, but it can also be the reason behind a lot of the anti-Semitism that we see today as well. And of course, Nazi Germany embraced that on steroids during the Holocaust because, Germany was a Christian nation, and they tried to exterminate the entire nation. And so, in my view, a replacement theology puts the scriptures in jeopardy. And I'll give you an example in Romans chapter 11, verse 1. I asked then, did God reject his people? What's it say? By no means. So replacement theology is refuted in one phrase. I'm an Israelite myself. Oh, he still knows who he is. A descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. What's it say in verse 2? God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Replacement theology is wrong. However, verse 7, and like I said, we're just scratching the surface, okay? What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly to gain, they did not obtain. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened, as it is written. And now we have to argue about election. We're not going to. But I think you'll know when you're elect when you decide, Jesus, I love you. I think that's a good point to make. But as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they could not see, ears that they could not hear to this very day. When they, as a nation generally, rejected Jesus, then God blinded them. And Paul says it's a partial blindness in part for a time, the time that we're living in now, known as the time of the Gentiles, the church age. Verse 11. Again, I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Again, refuting replacement theology. Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Goyim. You're a Goyim, the nations, Gentiles. Hallelujah. Verse 25, he says this, I don't want you to be ignorant then of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not become conceited. Because he's talking to Gentiles in Ephesus. Israel has experienced a hardening of heart in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. In this way, all Israel will be saved. Now, saying that, it does not mean that just because you've got Jewish heritage, you'll be born again. You've got to believe in Jesus. Paul is speaking, though, with a broad brush in this whole text to make sense of it. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. Now, Jesus had already come. So here's a promise that he's going to come back again to who? Zion, the Jew. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Turn it with me, if you would, to the book of Ephesians, chapter 2. We look at another place in Ephesians if we have time this morning, but Ephesians chapter 2, just making the point of the differences between Jew and Gentile, and then the church and God's promises. Ephesians 2. Verse 11. Therefore remember that formerly you were Gentiles by birth. Now you're not. Now you're a Christian. Gentile goyim actually means pagan. So you used to be a pagan. You can't be a Gentile Christian, really. That would say I'm a pagan Christian. So you can't really say that. Remember, therefore, you formerly are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcision by those who call themselves the circumcision. That's, Jews practice the rite of circumcision. Many Gentiles do these days, but Jews for certainly did. Who call themselves the circumcision which is done in the body by human hands. Now he's going to talk about a different kind of circumcision. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners in the covenants of the promise, without hope, without God in the world, but now in Christ Jesus. You, Gentile, Goyim, who are far away, have been brought near through the blood of Jesus Christ. For he is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. But remember, Paul has said earlier, I have not rejected Israel. They're still Jews. And there's us. So while they're one, they're distinguished by race, by setting aside in his flesh the law that was full of commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of two, thus making peace. And in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. So when Paul said all Israel will be saved, they've still got to get there through the cross. You don't get to God outside around the cross. He came and preached peace to you who are far away and peace to those who are near. Gentile far away, Jew near. Through him, we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Notice he says we both, so he's still delineating between the two, though they're one. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and all members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, and Christ himself is the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building is joined together to become a holy temple in the Lord, and in him you two are being joined together to become a habitation or a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. Israel is special to God. Jeremiah 31, Israel is special to God. I may have already made that point well, but let's look at it in Jeremiah 31. Israel is special to God. Verse 35, this is what the Lord says. He who appoints the sun to shine by day, who decrees the moons and the the moon and the stars to shine by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Almighty is his name. Only if these decrees vanish from my sight, declares the Lord, will Israel ever cease being a nation before me. Have you ever visited the ocean? Evidence Israel still exists. Did you notice the moon last night, the stars last night? Evidence that Israel still exists. Pretty plain, isn't it? This is what the Lord says. Only the heavens above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth below be searched out. Have they measured eternity? I don't think that they have. The foundation of the earth below be searched out. Has anyone gone to the center of the earth? Only on television. Only then will I reject all the descendants of Israel because of all that they have done. Israel is special to God. Even when they've been in captivity, such as the Babylonian captivity, because of their own sin. The prophet Zechariah said this, and he reminds them, he who touches you touches the apple of God's eye. They're in captivity in Babylon, but even then, they're still the apple of God's eye. Israel is special to God. God guarantees Israel will survive every enemy's effort to annihilate them. His love for Israel is covenantal. Deuteronomy 7. I did not choose you, speaking to Israel, the Jewish people, because you are so great and so powerful and so wonderful and so marvelous. No, quite the opposite. I picked you because you were nothing, so that I could demonstrate my glory through something that was nothing to show that I am everything. That's why God chose Israel. They were nothing. He wants that to be a demonstration in us too, by the way. Did you know that? We're just dust too. He wants us to be a demonstration of his glory. And that's what he said about Israel. And then still in Jeremiah 31, look in verse 3. This is what God says. Tracy's group is studying covenant. I'm pretty sure that this verse will probably be looked at least not, if not this verse, the word hesed will definitely be addressed. Verse 3, and the Lord appeared to us in the past saying, I've loved you with an everlasting love. I've drawn you with unfailing kindness. I will build you up again, virgin Israel. You will be rebuilt. That's the promise that one of these days we're going to see happen in Israel, this nation that seems to never leave the news. God has always been faithful to Israel, but as I already mentioned, Israel has not always been faithful to God. If you're still in Jeremiah, go over to chapter 30, verse 11. It's convenient. There's so many places we could be turning, but this is a helpful spot. This is what it says in verse 11, and it's the last part of verse 11. But then we're going to go back and read in verse 3 as well. But at the end of verse 11, it says this, I am with you and will save you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which you are scattered, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only in due measure. But I cannot let you go entirely unpunished. Did you know that the Bible says that God only disciplines those whom he loves? That's why he disciplines us. Have you ever met someone that seems to be getting by with bloody murder? It's because, they're not walking with God, and they're not one of his children, so go have at it. But if you're one of his children and he loves you, he will discipline, i.e. make your life miserable. He loves you that much. He must love me so much. You ever feel that way? God, could you just love somebody a little bit more than me? Because I don't know that I like being loved this much. I think that's, the fiddle on the roof guy. And then that we said, Lord, could you find I know we're special, but could you find a different special people for just a little while? Jeremiah 30, we're going to talk about Jacob's trouble, so we might as well just, since we're here, we have to turn back to it. Verse 6. Describing a time that hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. Ask and see, can a man bear children? Then why are they doubled over like they're having a baby? That's what he says. He sees in the Spirit. He goes, can a man bear children? Then why do I see every strong man with his hands on his stomach like a woman in labor? Because we're big sissies. How awful that day will be. No other will be like it. So there's a day coming that will be like no other day. This is what Jesus said, time of great distress such as never been seen in the whole world. The prophet Zechariah said the same thing. Daniel says the same thing. How awful that day will be. No other day will be like it. It will be the time of, and you've heard this phrase, the time of Jacob's trouble. Another word for the Great Tribulation. Daniel's 70th week, as we'll look at. A synonym for those three events. At that day, however, declares the Lord Almighty, I will break the yoke off their necks, and I will tear off their bonds. No longer will foreigners enslave them. And while Israel has peace within its boundaries, it's safer to go through Jerusalem, to walk through there at night, than it is downtown Kansas City, Missouri. That's what I've been told. I think it's the sixth safest country in the world to actually live inside. They don't have murders, they just have terrorists. But the point is, it's a very safe, secure place, but they have to react and respond to the nations around them every day. And God says, one of these days, I'm going to tear that off. It won't be there anymore. I mentioned in your notes, we're going to the second page now, how that, for example, just proof texting. I was taught to proof text. It's one of my problems when I preach. I feel like I've got to defend everything I say that I can. If I don't, even if I don't, I do. I can. That made sense. When God used Assyria to judge Israel, you know what God then? He went and judged Assyria, and that's in Isaiah chapter 10. God judges the judge that he used because he loves Israel and wants to demonstrate his covenantal love on Israel to be a demonstration of all of his covenantal love. God has a special plan for the nation of Israel. Satan despises both plan and planner. Genesis 17:8, the promises to Abraham. It came this way. Through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob became the nation of Israel. Jacob was Jacob, then he encountered God, he became Israel. That's where the nation of Israel came. And the promises to Abraham, well, those are the promises to Israel. By the way, by faith, we're grafted into that promise, aren't we? Into that same covenant. That's what Romans chapter 4 teaches. God's plan and Satan's hatred of that plan are the spiritual reasons why nations attack Israel. And that's what it says in Zechariah 2:2. It's Israel, because I love you, the nations are going to hate you. And also, and we might as well just dive into this real quick, but it's just scratch and sniff. You got your scratcher, you got your sniffer. We're going to scratch and sniff really, really quick and torment some of you, and that's okay. Revelation 12, another reason is because Israel hates the nation from which Messiah came. Revelation 12. And I'll just say this. If you hear somebody say, forget about the Old Testament, don't waste your time with it, then stop listening to that person. Because this verse makes absolutely no sense without the Old Testament. Absolutely no sense. In fact, that's true for nearly all prophecy. There's nothing that you can read in the New Testament prophetically that makes any sense unless you first go back to the Old Testament. And if you only read the Old Testament without the New Testament, you think, well, this is a waste of time. It didn't happen. But the New Testament, it's one book. It's one book. And again, there's discussion about this, but I'm going to read it. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars. Man, that's weird. LSD. The dude must have been on LSD. No, he knew Genesis 37. This is a quote from Genesis 37. He wasn't smoking pot. He wasn't on a low dose of meth. It's from the Old Testament. Really? I got wound up, didn't I? She was pregnant. Okay, so now when you're starting to read prophecy, you do have to really, really, really think. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 7 horns. This is this spirit that's been working the world from the overthrow almost, which will culminate in this last days one world government. But this plan of Satan has been enacted from the very beginning. It just has. And so when Herod was trying to destroy baby Jesus, that's the spirit. That's a demonstration. That's what we're reading about right now. She was pregnant, cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon. This is the devil with 7 heads and 10 horns, 7 crowns in his heads. Its tail swept a third of these stars out of the sky, flung them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, that it might devour her child. And Herod saw to it that everyone of that age did die except for Messiah. She gave birth to a son, a male child, that's Jesus, who was to rule all the nations with an iron scepter. With her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. And now when you read the book of Revelation, you need to write this down. And I'd like that we're just scratching the surface, but write down Revelation 1:19. Revelation 1, verse 19. And you'll see it says to John, this book of Revelation, write down what you have just seen, the things that are and the things that will be. There's three divisions in the book of Revelation. Revelation 1:19. The things that you've seen, well, what did he see? If you know Revelation 1, which you need to know Revelation 1, it's the only book of the Bible that says you'll be blessed if you read it. So don't say, I can't read the book of Revelation. It's just too complicated. The guy must have been on drugs. Well, Jesus said, read the book from the guy with on drugs because you'll be blessed. Anyway, Revelation chapter 1. What did he see? He saw Jesus in the midst of the candlesticks, the church. Holding the angels assigned to the churches. That's what Jesus is doing right now. He's in the midst. You've heard me pray, Jesus, as you walk in the midst of this candlestick this morning. That's what John saw. And then he says the things which are, and then in chapters 2 and 3, he describes 7 churches, which are probably chronological through church history, but also, I'll tell you what, if you read about any one of those churches and you find yourself in it, it was written to you. If you find our church in one of those 7, it was written to us. So he says, the things that you've seen, that vision of Jesus, the glorified Jesus, beautiful resurrected Jesus, the 7 churches, that's us, the church age, and then the things which shall be, future things. Revelation chapter 4, verse 2, it says, come up. Heard a trumpet, come up. Personally, I think that's the rapture. And you don't read about the church anymore in the book of Revelation. You don't read about it one more time. You read about Israel all of the time. But you don't see mentioned of the church after Revelation chapter 4. Well, we're still around, so basically most of Revelation chapter 4 hasn't happened, except for there are these times, this is how prophecy works. I'm not going to apologize. This is how God who wrote it. In prophecy, there will also be these time stand still parenthetical insertions. You know what I mean by that? As prophecy is being made and things predicted, an event will be described in that prophecy, such as in Revelation chapter 12. I know, frustrated some of you, scratch and sniff some of you. Others go, yeah, that's what I've always thought. I'm glad to hear Pastor Jeff say that. Okay, we need to move on. After 70 AD, Israel temporarily stopped existing as a nation. In prophetic fulfillment, I quoted this last week, Isaiah 66. Can a nation be born in a day? You betcha. Because that's what happened with Israel, born in one day. Isaiah 68, 8 through 11. Other prophecies about Israel. Israel stopped existing when the temple was torn down in 70 AD. It was rebuilt in like 136 by the Romans and given a brand new name. I don't remember that name. But marvelously, miraculously, in 1948, May 14th, Israel emerged as a nation, and prophetic conversation was jump-started all over again. Rightfully so, because what looked to be impossible happened. Augustine said God had forgotten about the Jews. Martin Luther said terrible things about the Jews. Well, there wasn't a nation there. I can almost understand why they might have said those things. But when it popped back up, you got to pay attention. Now, with Israel, once again, a flourishing nation. I mean, a flourishing nation. They just discovered oil deposits that may be equal to Saudi Arabia's oil deposits there. The Dead Sea itself is more mineral rich than any other location on the planet, and it hasn't even been harvested yet. All those minerals and microminerals, as you know right now in our world technology economy, those minerals are very, very valuable. Per capita, the most productive agricultural country in the world. They control the diamond industry. The rose that you bought or you will buy for your loved one on Valentine's Day, there's a good chance it might have come from Israel. Did you know that? Israel is flourishing. Second only to the U.S. and the NASDAQ are Jewish companies. Second only to Silicon Valley are there more startup technological companies in Israel. So when you read about a nation wanting to come and take a spoil from Israel, that might be what we're describing. In fact, name drop and hit myself in the back or something. But I was in Topeka the day when the governor signed an agreement. A lot of the technology innovation going on in Wichita and a lot of the agrarian water preservation properties taking place in western Kansas all come from Israel. Israel is a world ruler and leader in so many areas of economics. With Israel now prospering as a nation, and the establishment of the Temple Institute, and Andrew Brookins has actually been there and seen it, where they have all the things ready to do temple sacrifices. Seriously, they do. Many rabbis are prepared to rebuild the temple and are hoping to resume sacrifices. You've heard all this discussion about the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer. They can't, if they build the temple, they cannot resume sacrifices until they follow what's been prescribed in the old covenant to purify that altar with the ashes of a red heifer. We had red heifers in Illinois. Those are those red cows. They're not really red. I think they're orange-brown, kind of rust color, but they're called a red heifer. There can't be even a white hair on those. And they've got 5 now in Israel. They came from Utah, by the way. It's interesting, isn't it? I have to pay attention to this. I'm paid. That's why I'm paid to do this. They're watching them right now to see, boy, if no white hairs show up on these red heifers, we could actually sacrifice these, put their ashes on the altar, and if we had an altar, we could start doing sacrifices again. Because you see, hardness in part has happened in Israel. Their eyes are closed that the Messiah has already come. Their eyes are just closed. They think they've been without a sacrifice since 70 AD. Every Passover, nearly every Passover, I share this. We do a Seder. On 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, a mother went to a rabbi and said, "Rabbi, what are we going to do? The temple's been destroyed. We have no more temple." And the rabbi said, "Well, your kitchen table will be your altar until we have another one." And that's what Israel's been doing. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was reelected again, which I think is a miracle. We had the Abrahamic Peace Accord with President Trump. Saudi Arabia wants to join that group. These are all Muslim nations. And you got to pay attention to this because it talks about in Ezekiel 38, maybe verse 13 or something, Shebna and Dedan. I know you know those names. When Israel's invaded in the Gog-Magog war, Ezekiel 37, 38, 39, these nations are going to say, "Why are you invading Israel?" Well, guess who Shebna and Dedan are? That's Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia and Israel are actually now friends. And as you may recall, the 9/11 attackers came from Saudi Arabia. Such strange alliances now lining up in these last days. We need to pay attention to these things. Don't worry about whether Kelsey's on the injury report or not. Don't worry about the high ankle sprain. Pay attention to what God's doing. That's God's time clock in Israel. Iran's alliance with Russia, Syria, and Turkey has Israel daily poised to defend itself, and they did last night. And those are the nations described in Ezekiel 38 that are going to one day, I think, after the rapture and the turmoil of all that time, that will invade and attack Israel. And right now, they're all in alliance. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? And Brian can't tell us or he'd have to shoot us, but last week, the largest historical ever joint military exercise between the U.S. and Israel took place. There's reason for that. Okay. We're just going to look at this chart and we're going to close. And we'll come back in 2 weeks. There's going to be a last days time period that revolves around Israel. This time has several names. It could be referred to as the Great Tribulation. That's what Jesus called it. Remember last week when I got kind of froze up here for a moment because I was reading the New International Version, and I know it all in the King James Bible. It's one of my problems, not your problem. And the word tribulation wasn't appearing, the word distress, and I found myself lost. But Jesus called it a time of great distress, the Great Tribulation. The time of Jacob's trouble, which I just mentioned, and then Daniel's 70th week. And again, we'll just close here, and I can tell we just need to come back to this topic. I'm going to do a very short devotion-length sermon about something different next Sunday previous to the business meeting. So we're just going to stop at this chart. I want to introduce it to you. and then I'll go to the conclusion, what we're going to take home. Daniel 9. Verse 24. Daniel's 70th weeks. 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression. So we're clearly talking about Jerusalem. This is coming on the heels of, I reread this several times yesterday morning, Daniel 9, where Daniel is confessing the sins of his people because he's in Babylon because of the sins of their people. And rather than just simply blaming somebody else for the fact he was in Babylon, he confesses his own sins too, which I think is what we ought to be doing for our nation's sins, but not forget about our own personal sins. And Daniel has prayed that through, and then Gabriel appears. The angel Gabriel appears and gives him this. 77s are decreed for your people and holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness. See, this hasn't happened yet. To bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal up a vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. This is where God's throne will be on planet Earth someday. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, some of your translations will say anointed one. It's the Hebrew word Mashiach, Messiah, anointed one. The ruler comes. There will be 7 sevens. Now look at your chart. Scholars pretty much, even though they disagree with interpretations, scholars unilaterally say these are 7 weeks of years. So when you see weeks, you see years. 7 times 7 is 49. All right? That's what the chart says over here. That's what you got in front of me. And because the Jewish calendar, again, scratch and sniff, is in lunar months, we're solar. Because I know it gets complex really, really fast. I can't apologize. It's just the way things are. It's just the way things are. In leap year, in the Hebrew calendar, they have 13 months. They really do. They have Adon 1 and Adon 2. And every 19 years, they have 7 of those. So it's really hard to set exact dates, okay? That's what I'm saying. However, we do know this. We do know this, and I've got several dates here. Approximately around the time 445 BC, Cyrus sent Nehemiah, Ezra back to rebuild the temple and the nation, the building, the city of Jerusalem. We have an approximate date of that. And it says it took 49 years to rebuild it, and that's how long it actually took to rebuild it. Okay? So then I'm going to read on just a little bit more. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. We'll talk about the 62 sevens in just a moment. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, or some translation would say a wall or a moat. And that's exactly what happened. Israel, the nation of Israel, rebuilt Jerusalem. It was in destruction, rebuild it, but it says it will be in troublesome times, and it was. You know the name Sanballat and Tobiah, ever heard those names? These are people that tried to make them stop. The prophet Haggai prophesied during that time, and Zechariah prophesied during that time. And it says that the work prospered because of the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah. It was a troublesome time, but they got it rebuilt, and it was a mess when they started. You can read that. Again, you got to read the Old Testament. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe what a mess it was and how difficult it was, but they got it done in 49 years. And then it says there's 62 more sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death. That means crucified. Take a look at your chart. Multiply 60. Multiply 62 times 7. You get 434 years. I've talked about this several Christmases. How in the world did the Magi know, the wise men from Persia, from Babylon, think it was time to go and find Messiah? Because Daniel wrote this in Babylon. And these Magi, these scholars, through the generations would be reading all of these Old Testament books, especially what Daniel left behind. He had lived there. And they knew the year. They knew the year. It has been almost 483 years. And then a star appeared in the sky over this place, and it made total sense to pack up and go and find this one, this Messiah. They didn't have the exact date, but they counted back the years. Wow, that much. Wow, look at that star. Daniel, what he said, it's, depending on how you do the lunar months and all that, but 483 years, they packed their camels and they start coming across to Jerusalem. That's the Christmas story. And I've talked about that before. But it says that the Messiah will be cut off. He'll be crucified. And if you're looking at your chart, it's at that line where I show prophetic gap. It's at that line on the left-hand side in your notes, left-hand side over here. It's right there where Daniel's 69 weeks, Israel's prophetic clock stopped. And I just read about the time of the Gentiles. And we're going to pick it up next week at Ephesians chapter 3, which is the verse right in the middle, and we'll go from there. I think that's probably enough for now. I really would urge you to go back and look at all these notes and read ahead a little bit. We'll come back to this in 2 weeks. And I tell you, I would love to do a lengthy conversational discussion Bible study on this. It needs to be done. I should have been doing it a long time ago. And I can only say I think I've been a product of the exaggerations and people really not wanting to be interested, and I've honored that, and I think maybe I was wrong. So we're going to stop right there, but I'm going to take you to the back page, and I have the musicians come up.